I'm going to tell you the scariest true story ever told, over thousands of years, in thousands of versions with different names and minute details, but the story always ends the same way, with the next end of the world. We'll give you the short version first, and then the burden of proof will fall here to present the evidence across time and topic that the slow crawl of geology, the wind, water, fire, and tectonic creep is punctuated in rare occasions by disastrous upheaval. The Earth's magnetic field reverses, with dramatic excursion events sprinkled between. They can occur in less than 100 years from plunge to rock bottom. Earth's ongoing magnetic event has already been underway 150 years, into the red zone, and it is speeding up. In early 2019, the magnetic event accelerated to where an update to the world magnetic model was required ahead of schedule for the first time. Well, so far, this has not been causing catastrophic events, but unfortunately there are other aspects to the event coming. Both in physical evidence and in the stories told in rock and voice, the Sun plays the role of the destroyer. Where the decadal and centennial cycles of activity converge, we find the entire magnetic potential of the Sun accessible for what can only be described as a micronova. As unbelievable as that might sound, the evidence will actually show this to be an almost unavoidable consequence of the solar system trip through the galaxy. There is evidence that the crust and mantle unlock at the low velocity zone. The plates collide and may be worse, triggering volcanoes and sending unfathomable amounts of water into the land, creating surge deposits of bone and earth. The earthquakes and volcanoes and tsunamis are followed by snow, ice, incredible amounts falling by the yard as Earth's temperature plummets. We'll see evidence at the micro scale of the previous great solar blast, the ways in which humans survived the last great catastrophe, the evidence that similar plans are secretly unfolding beneath our feet, and the evidence demonstrating the cover-up and erroneous geological science that overthrew a course of rediscovery, one that can now lead us to understand that the Sun's cyclical passage through the galactic electric sheet is the trigger for the great catastrophe cycle on Earth. Here is Chapter 1 of the only work on the catastrophe that was classified. With a rumble so low as to be inaudible, growing, then fuming into a thundering roar, the earthquake starts. Only it's not like any earthquake in recorded history. In California, the mountains shake like ferns in a breeze. The mighty Pacific rears back and piles up into a mountain of water more than 2 miles high, then starts its race eastward. With the force of 1,000 armies, the wind attacks. Within 3 hours, the fantastic wall of water moves across the continent, burying the wind-ravaged land under 2 miles of seething water coast to coast. Central America suffers the same cannonade. South America finds the Andes not high enough to stop the cataclysmic violence pounded out by nature in her berserk rage. In less than a day, Ecuador, Peru, western Brazil are shaken madly by the devastating earthquake, burned by molten earth fire, buried under cubic miles of torrential Pacific seas, and then turned into a frozen hell. Everything freezes. Man, beast, plant, and mud are all rock hard in less than 4 hours. Europe cannot escape the onslaught. Western Africa and the sands of the Sahara vanish in nature's wrath. The area bounded by the Congo, South Africa, and Kenya suffers only severe earthquakes and wind. Survivors there marvel at the sun standing still in the sky for nearly half a day. As the Arctic basin leaves its polar home, Eastern Siberia, Manchuria, China, and Burma are subjected to the same annihilation as South America: wind, earth fire, inundation, and freezing. The Bay of Bengal basin, just east of India, is now at the North Pole. The Pacific Ocean, just west of Peru, is at the South Pole. Australia is the new, unexplored continent in the North Temperate Zone, with only a few handfuls of survivors populating its vastness. The cataclysm has done its work well, and drives the pitiful few who survive into a new Stone Age. Once more, the Earth has shifted its shell, with the poles moving almost to the equator in a fraction of a day. Again, the atmosphere and oceans, refusing to change direction with the Earth's shell, have wiped out almost all life. After this tumble, we'll join Noah, Adam and Eve, Atlantis, Mu, and Olympus. So that paints a pretty terrible picture. If not for the fact that it was classified by the CIA, it might be worth ignoring entirely as science fiction. And indeed, that version is too extreme, but the evidence does suggest a slightly lesser version of that same event does indeed occur during these upheavals. Now, it is our job to show you the evidence from start to finish, and these are the points we will need to hit to do so. Let's begin in the 1700s, with a surge of global exploration in science and the discovery of the evidence for these cycles. A dozen researchers became dozens in the 1800s as more evidence and excitement and terror over the implications of the evidence was mounting in an undeniable charge to science to explain all the evidence. The 1900s saw a further growth of the field. Many researchers gained considerable fame, while others were silenced. The end of the century saw the birth of the plasma universe connection to catastrophism, with the first global study of petroglyphs describing a solar catastrophe in antiquity. The story truly begins, relevantly however, with the man almost certainly responsible for the misdirection of the truth, Charles Hapgood. His Earth crust displacement theory became the torch for the catastrophe cycle, and when it bombed, it took down the entire field with it. We will demonstrate his motive and opportunity to cheat Einstein, that he knew the truth, he covered it up. In the 1940s, one of the most critical scenes of this theater played out at the North Pole. Major Maynard E. White led the first mission to map and understand the Arctic region, mostly because of navigational concerns and to monitor for Soviet attacks over the pole. When it became imperative to locate the magnetic pole position, the scientists found much more than they bargained for when they got their boots on the ground. They found evidence of marine strata, lifted to significant altitude, time after time, and with tropical corals found in that Arctic region strata, complementing the evidence of similar fossils found by Admiral Byrd in Antarctica, both complementing the prehistoric trees unearthed in Norway which had no rings. All in all, Major White's team believed that they had unearthed 9 levels of catastrophe on the planet. These findings were reported at the Pentagon, attended also by Paul Sipple of the RAND Corporation and presumably members of the Office of Strategic Services, where Charles Hapgood was a key player in geophysics. And working with Major White's findings and Dr. Sipple's experiments, it was concluded that Earth's magnetic pole began slowly accelerating, followed by a whip around the geographic polar region, which somehow tilts the planet back and forth, which is why there is evidence of the polar regions in the same places over and over, because it always tilts right back and appears to have not moved over geologic time. They confirmed the catastrophe aspects of the new mountain range creation and ice age conditions immediately following the great event. Charles Hapgood, Paul Sipple, and the Pentagon are perhaps the most credible advocates of this 10 to 12,000 year cycle of disaster on Earth, especially when you consider what they did next. Hapgood continued his classified life while also teaching at various universities up through the late 60s. During the 50s, in the years following Major White's Arctic mission, Charles Hapgood stepped into the limelight in his public life with the famous Earth's crust displacement theory. It was a much mutated version from what we heard from Major White, where the poles do not go back and forth to the same places, the cycle is twice as long, and instead of a one-day event, it takes thousands of years to complete, and which was easily debunked by modern geophysicists, taking down the entire science of catastrophism with it. That is the famous version with the foreword written by Albert Einstein. That is not disputed, as his work with Hapgood was well known in the years before he died. However, Einstein was likely privy to the same information as Hapgood, and the final book came out after he died. There is no way of knowing if Einstein supported the radically different version that Hapgood eventually espoused. But what we do know is that Einstein saw the cycle of catastrophe and the turning over of the Earth. He was looking for a way to unlock the crust from the low-velocity zone in the years before he died, and we know he never did find a sufficient geophysical mechanism. Hapgood's version of the story, the public one, does not match what he and Sipple delivered to Major White at the Pentagon a decade earlier. It does not match the geological evidence or the timelines as well. Hapgood's versions, again, were easily debunked. Now, Einstein discussed this for years with Hapgood, and the only contribution was a foreword. Maybe. But, armed with that foreword, the weak version of crust displacement Hapgood placed over the field had the credibility to do so. The Chan-Thomas version matches the version that somehow got lost between the Pentagon and Charles Hapgood's public life. It plainly contradicts the version that the CIA geophysicist Charles Hapgood was promoting around the world, even if he had promoted a different one in private. And Chan's version got classified, as apparently did that real version of the story reported from what Major White and Paul Sipple provided. Einstein's key problem was the evidence of Greenland's tilting action, but a lack of weight in ice to pull the crust itself. Nobody had ever before discovered a mechanism for how the Earth would actually accomplish this unfathomable disrespect of inertia, basic physics, common logic. Frankly, the explanations blaming the hand of God had about as much evidence as anything else up until that point. That is, until the version Chan-Thomas tried to put out. The postlude of Chan's work was not part of the sanitized release by the CIA, but it was included in a 1993 version of the book the CIA apparently didn't feel the need to classify due to the disrepute of the field of catastrophism. Nobody cares anymore. The postlude describes the only potential mechanism for connection of all the evidence from beneath our feet out to the sun. In recent years, the move in cosmology to see the galactic magnetic field structure as coherent, including the central torus and jet model, has run through the national labs and NASA with incredible success. But one of the lesser publicized realizations of this fact is the scaled similarity with the solar system and with Earth's equatorial ion emission. You see, just like the solar system, the galaxy has an electromagnetic current sheet rippling around the equator, separating the coherent fields of north and south. Now, in our solar system, the sheet ripples, wavering around the equator, bringing a spike in ion density and a reversal of the interplanetary magnetic fields. At Earth, although our orbit only crosses the exact solar equator twice per year, the solar electric current sheet hits Earth every 2 weeks and can produce a geomagnetic storm, inducing electric currents in the atmosphere and the ground. Earth is constantly protected by its own magnetic field, but in addition to things like solar flares, simply enduring a every 2 week solar system magnetic reversal and current sheet impact can cause those electromagnetic disruptions. So, what happens when the Sun and solar system encounter the galactic version, its spike in density, and its magnetic reversal process? Let's actually add one more element to that puzzle: the dust. In our own solar system, and most we see, there is a dusty plain, like Saturn's rings. Density is low from planet formation over time, but in the galaxy that is not the case. There are dusty remnants of countless nova, and material left over from the star formation events of the galaxy. So the galactic sheet is more ion dense, a galactic magnetic reversal, and a much more dusty region than we find in our own solar system. Now, out of those three, it might seem like the galactic magnetic field reversal and the extra ion and electron density are the scarier propositions than the dust. But in fact, it might be the dust that makes the situation so awful. To understand why, we must investigate a phenomenon known as recurrent nova.
And so what this is here, and this list will be ever expanding, these are the current recurring nova in the Milky Way, with the exception of the one that was just discovered about a week and a half ago, that was in the Large Magellanic Cloud. I don't know if they're going to count that one as being in the Milky Way or not. But take a look over, it's the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th column, where it has a bunch of years. Those are the known outburst years. Just take a look at how many times these ones have actually gone boom, some of them. All of the lectures that students are hearing right now, and some of the best literature reviews on this topic that you can find, very much conclude one thing on this list. It is egregiously under-inclusive. They say that our viewing of the heavens at this level is so nascent that there are almost certainly supernova that we have seen that aren't supernova, that we will see them go boom again, and they will make this list. They believe that there are many with hundreds to thousands of year cycles that we simply have not seen go boom even once, and when we do, we'll have no idea it's a recurrent nova for hundreds to thousands of years more.
There is a concern for the lower-level L-shell magnetic fields, the smaller arches instead of the global fields connecting to the polar regions. In most solar blasts, even the worst ones we only see every decade or so now, the magnetosphere of Earth compresses down to those outer L-shells, but still connects to the polar region in the most exposed outer zones. But in the extreme scenario, it could be very different. The modeling of the Great Solar Storm of 1859, for example, which lit telegraph wires on fire and shocked operators, came close to hitting the lowest level L shells. And if that were to actually happen on Earth in a superflare or micronova, then you get the potential for a magnetar-type discharge, where its own processes are thought to surge energy through its L shell fields, arc down, and literally crack the surface of the star. At that point, the loss of power grids might be one of the lesser concerns. As for the electric geology, lab results confirm this action on terrestrial planets. The only question is, did it happen before and could it happen again? The galactic trigger, the dust and gas mechanism for superflares and recurrent nova, the evidence on the moon, the stories of our ancestors, the global nature of the disaster, all point to the sun as the destroyer. But is it a superflare or a micronova? And does it really matter? To look at this question, we will first investigate the recent history of magnetic events on Earth, starting with the one ongoing now. The key element in this overall process is one that has already begun to unfold again here, and the clock is ticking as we move deeper into the shift. We know that Earth's magnetic field has begun an acceleration beyond its normal wander, and coincident with that is the loss of field strength. Magnetic reversals as rapid as 80 years have been recorded in the paleomagnetic record, and we are already more than double that many years into the current shift. While moving more slowly than the record-fast reversals, things have begun to intensify. The Earth's magnetic field is currently decreasing by approximately 5% per decade, with the north and south magnetic poles set to meet in the eastern Indian Ocean. While the north is moving much faster, the south has already left the continent of Antarctica. The timeline is on the scale of a few decades to 100 years, presuming things don't accelerate any further. Seem impossible? Well, these are the current motions, and that is not disputed. There have been no less than 50 papers in the last 4 months identifying one or more of the last magnetic excursion events, some from cave sediments, others from corings, but we continue to see the cycle, even though some still confuse Lake Mungo and Mono Lake, and even today, many confused Lechamp with the half-cycle Adams event around 42,000 years ago. It shows up a lot, and so do the half events Helena Pali and the Noah event, 18,000 and 6,000 years ago. There have been dozens of new recurrent nova, leaving a star behind or performing encores of previously seen events, and seen many more nova-level events with energies no bigger than the sun's solar flares. And in terms of driving forward the known science, the importance of the sun's current sheet, the solar wind BY, the interplanetary magnetic and electric field, is as big a factor in Earth's electrodynamic near-space interactions as CMEs and coronal holes.
We call them excursions, magnetic excursions, which is, a term that's well integrated in the literature now. And these are very short-lived reversals, but they're associated with minima in field intensity, and it's the minima in field intensity that are implicated because when you have low field strength, you enhance UVR.
One of the most foundational elements of this channel, one of the most markable moments in history time and time again, and one of the most dire conditions of our modern existence is the weakening of Earth's magnetic field. We're going to dive deeper on a recent update to this ongoing event, and we will end by learning just how fast the magnetic field is going to be declining when it hits full speed. This week, We reviewed this article and discussed how the weakening magnetic field is beginning to allow significant penetration advancement of charged particles into Earth's upper atmospheric layers. To understand just how significant of a change has taken place, we will look not at the polar fields wrapping around the globe, but the L-shells, the smaller arcs that touch lower latitudes, and while they go up to L6 and beyond in theory, the innermost shells here are what are most important. The number corresponds to Earth radii altitude, so the L1.5 shell extends out to 1.5 Earth radii. The particles in focus in this paper are said to have dropped from a little less than 1 Earth radius down more than 500 kilometers, and that is not such a small change at all, especially when you consider that it's not been a constant drop, not by a long shot. The process has been accelerating, making this a direct measurement of one of the scariest potential events for an excitement of that lowest L shell in a solar superstorm. Both of those animations are from NASA and represent what happens when the sun juices up those fields in modern-day regular storms and when a major event happens, modeled with a magnetar burst. That'd be fun on Earth, eh? So, how fast are things going to get? Well, first let's review where we are now. The most famous announcement of the 10% field loss was in the year 2000 by NASA. Here we not only learned about the weakening field, but that the magnetic poles were shifting and speeding up. In the north, this modern shift began in 1859, coincident with the Great Carrington Event solar storm, and the North Pole has now gone over the top, as they say, and is heading southward towards Siberia. During this time, the South Magnetic Pole has been on a slower saunter, but is way out in the lead, already having left the continent of Antarctica. In 2010, the European Space Agency updated that number from 10% to 15%, which is really a psychotically huge jump from the 10% lost from 1859 up to 2000. But it was real, and the leader of the mission measuring Earth's magnetic field made no bones about the fact that Earth's magnetic field was getting ready to flip. He quickly and very quietly lost his position shortly after revealing that Earth's magnetic field had gone from losing 5% per century to 5% per decade. This put a lot of folks on notice, especially those who were repeatedly proving that these events are extinction-level moments for many species and major hits to the biosphere, and doing so in the top journals, and for those tracking the field across the world and showing how rapidly this event is happening while we all clamor over COVID and climate change. Folks, we are in big trouble. For those who forget, the official science says that when she goes fast, 100 times the mark used by NASA's 5% per century. Severely extreme. And by the way, that would be 5% lost per year, about 1% every 72 days. When she goes, it's going to be a couple years at most. That's not a joke. This is not a joke. At 5% loss per decade, we are now down 20% or more, and if Earth's magnetic field accelerates again, it is very bad news. And as many of you probably recall, it is very likely that it has accelerated again in the 2019 and 2020 geomagnetic jerk after the more regionally focused shift in 2017. Below this video, you will find a playlist, the playlist, detailing what this cycle is on Earth, how terrible it has been in the past, and how we're due in the cycle timeline again. And what do you know? Observational evidence of every kind indicates that fate appears unwilling to show mercy or alter her gate for the sake of our vanity. And she's at the front gates right now. First is the weakening of the magnetic field, and the blue line shows how we got up to here, and then a continuation with no further accelerations to the weakening field. The colorful breakout point is from right now. The red is where the ESA swarm manager told us we had about 100 to 200 years before he got fired. The yellow is a slow advance to that 5% per year mark we mentioned in that special video from about a week ago in this paper. The green shows the curve to approximately Doug Vogt's 2046 date, and the orange curve shows what happens if we basically shot to 5% field loss per year right now. My absolute best guess is that we will be somewhere around here, between the orange and the green lines. My best guess on the crescendo of the disaster. And of course, I do continue to insist you keep in mind that the bad stuff begins earlier, potentially years before, when the field gets too weak to protect our electrified way of life. That's well before the crescendo. The second chart is one I've talked about updating a fair bit, almost a year now, most notably in the inclusion of the next to last column on the right. Finally got it in there. Whether or not the early effects would be seen. Now for veterans, you've likely seen this chart before, and its purpose is to show how the combination of the galactic current sheet and the punctuation of the solar micronova is the only way to explain all the evidence that seems to come at the same time every cycle. That new column is specifically for the effects we're tracking now, which would really only be seen with a magnetic excursion and the micronova scenario. The magnetic excursion only scenario actually fails as well when you realize it wouldn't be affecting the other planets. Dr. Paul Laviolette himself suggested there is no pregame to his superwave. When it arrives, it's all over. This leaves only one option to include that crescendo, and everything we're tracking up to it, that option isn't blue. But speaking of the other planets, and all the things changing right now, forget the past for a moment and let's focus on the now. This chart compiles all the key Earth changes in red, the other planets, the Sun and interplanetary space in yellow, and the other stars nearby in blue. I highly suggest you look through this and see if there is any part of it on which you don't feel solid. These three charts we saw here are among dozens that could be used in catastrophism, but they're also a very good progression of a simple and understandable curve on a chart up to what happens each cycle and what we are dealing with now. And then finally here, to all the evidence that it's happening again. We have shown a lot of the evidence already. They know from the polarization, dust density, gamma signatures, and more that the galactic current sheet ripples every few tens of light years, bringing the galactic magnetic reversal. But they have never been able to quite make the observations fit into their models or the theory. Now, what it finally took to bring those models and theory up to the observations of the current sheet was nova-level energy along the way. You've got to be kidding me. After all this, the galactic magnetic triggering of the solar micronova and similar events throughout the galaxy is what it takes to complete the picture. Not on board yet? Let's add to everything we know about the Earth's rotation in the Sun, and add in the fact that it's the thermosphere super rotation, its faster rotation than the ground below, being due to energy from above and geomagnetism. This, of course, must be true if all those other connections we've implied down to the core are true as well. How do you go from the heat and energetic input of the solar blast to an ice age? The answer will ultimately determine whether a solar aspect is a super flare or a micronova.
Sometimes admitting you don't know, at least your mind is open to look for more evidence. Right now, the pressing issue is, if I'm right that this next Gleisberg cycle is going to be when the reversal happens, I'm going to be like 99 years old. And some of you are probably not going to make it either in 27 years. But it's for the children and grandchildren and the unborn generations.
Oddly, as vastly more energetic as a nova event would be than a solar flare, it may bring about more of the cooling effects to our planet. To explain the ice ages occurring with the magnetic reversals, we must actually look to either that nova-like event or the tilting of the Earth's crust, which vexed Einstein for a solution he never found beneath our feet. The Sun does not bulge, in blatant disrespect of physics. It has a secret. Its cycles always build to greater crescendos, and the great solar blast could truly disrupt our entire planet. While Vogt does not advocate for a tilt of Earth, he does advocate for a reversal of rotation. The stories of the Sun rising in the wrong place. The stories of the long night where tribes believed the Sun might never rise again. The stories of the Sun standing still in the sky. All of those ancient stories from around the world complement those found in the rock. Interestingly, either a 90-degree tilt and tilt back and forth, as was described by Chan Thomas, Albert Einstein, and Major White, or the rotation reversal advocated by Vogt, both leave evidence of the poles residing in the same positions over millions of years, cycle after cycle bouncing back to the same places, such that if you were to look over long periods of time, you might think the pole has never moved at all.
It's a little bit difficult to go back and to say, well, the story is not exactly so. We have the phenomena from all places, from the bottom of the sea with ash and with nickel, which is of meteoric origin. The terrestrial axis moved. And that paleomagnetism proves us that terrestrial axis, that magnetic axis, and possibly like Runcorn and other of Manchester, claim that the Earth turned over. We know now from observation of Professor Danjon, director of Paris Observatory, that flares on the sun may influence the speed of rotation of the Earth, and there were sudden changes. We generally don't like to know that we are traveling on a accident-prone planet.
But what would cause the change? A change in frequency, a change in voltage, a change in the cycle. Over time, the last 12,000 years, increasing Earth's temperatures, higher voltage. Decreasing Earth's temperatures, lower voltage. We're heading into a grand solar minimum right now. Would explain a lot of the changes that we're seeing on the planet. So to give an example, Sapphire has replicated the atmosphere of the sun in a laboratory on Earth. You can scale this up or down, and when you increase the voltage input, you notice how the state changes, the visual spectrum changes. It starts to take different forms of matter, glow, and then what we start to see here is an enormous amount of petroglyphs forming in front of your eyes. But the state is changing depending on the current inflow. Now the same thing apparently somebody witnessed from the airplane window, and this is what we're capturing here. The sun is going into a very low state of solar activity, grand solar minimum at the minimum, and possibly 5 of these cycles in a once in a 2,000-year event, because the planetary geometry that we're going to see in 2024 has not been seen since 79 AD, almost a 2,000-year repeat. So with the Earth's waning and weakening magnetosphere, we should start to see a lot of energetic particles visible to the naked eye running right down the magnetic field lines of our planet, and lo and behold, in front of you, this is not an auroral arc like Steve. This is the Northern Lights following a magnetic field line down on top of our planet.
Now we need to take something in physics called a block wall. If you have a looping toroid magnetic field on the right and you have a looping toroid magnetic field on the left and they're separate, think about magnets on the table, and then you get them close enough where they start to tug, and then you bring that 3D again and you got that looping toroid. Well, those fields are going to overlap somewhere. And where the overlapping center point is, there's a place of zero magnetism, and it's called the block wall. And I really believe the Earth is going to go through that block wall for however long it is, whether it be seconds, minutes, or hours, in October of 2024. Yeah, I sent you a couple graphics of the solar system scope as you were talking about energies in the heavens, diagrams or the rotation orbits where they sit on those dates, but also my alignment that I keep calling. You know, these Uranus, Jupiter, Saturn, and Neptune are making a square in the outer solar system. These 4 mega planets are going to make their own slight new magnetic field out there, interlooping in a toroid wave, but then our sun is definitely going to connect electromagnetically to those out there. You got to be kidding me. There's almost a 2,000-year event we're going to see with the electromagnetism. So
we're getting into heavier gravitational fields, waning and depleting magnetic field on the planet, but outer gas giants are starting to line up more gravity and electromagnetism for us as we speak daily. Well, during this alignment where we're going to be between the sun and those 4 gas giants out there in the middle of these 2 looping fields, out in front of the sun doesn't come until, May of 2025. But if you pull it back a little bit into October of 2024, that looping field, like there would be no magnetic fields in that. So you have to think about what would be delivered in terms of a download during that time, because your brain would not know how to function. I mean, even most of us that you consider sane human beings would not be able to function, because if you're losing the magnetic orientation of how your brain moves electrical signals around it so you can think and have thoughts and do things, bodily function, whatever. Move that arm. That's an electrical function that just happened because there's 2 different magnetic fields firing off in my brain. But it's going to be a specific set of circumstances with a canceling magnetic field on the human residence, on the brain, and literally everything on the planet. Like birds will experience it, reptiles will experience it, but how would the Earth experience it? Because the Earth being, and they'll take me, a devil's advocate here, going to go two directions. Earth, a spinning object in space with a different polarity on the crust and the core. So just different magnetic fields, positive, negative. Crust is negative, and they discharge sometimes or absorb charge, change charges. And that crust, the reason it's locked in and we don't really spin around on it too much is because it's magnetically locked to layers deeper down in the crust or down into the core for the rest of the planet. If there's no magnetic field, those don't lock anymore, so everything just kind of does its gingerly loop. That's on the planetary side. And then all of a sudden, whoosh, it goes back in. Everything locks back in like a trillionth of a second. Whoosh, that magnetic field locks again. And then everything restarts itself, but it's been refreshed. As I could exactly see, because I talked to Robert Felix at length about this. Like, where do these evolutionary leaps come from? And that very well could be another one, triggered by the cosmic rays and the zero magnetic field and the block wall. And there's different things that go on sometimes that create a huge amount of movement, like the earthquake in Japan. We learned about plate tectonics. Things are supposed to move like a millimeter per year. That's all the continents are supposed to move at. And then we had the Fukushima quake, and the entire island chain moved 8 feet. There's these orders of magnitude above kind of events that happen that cause huge shifts. And that's exactly what that block wall is one of these events. I don't know if it's the elite trying to cause as much scatterbrainness going into this magnetic field canceling wall. And when I say they, I'm talking the same nefarious players that are trying to control society and move it in directions from the central banks to the Bank for International Settlements, all these Bilderberger Group, everything you're hearing about with the Klaus Schwab reset, and all these politicians bought and paid for implementing policy dictated by, and who knows what it is, an entity that they're worshiping. I don't know, it gets a little bizarre sometimes, but I'm just curious if we're getting specifically stuck in like a staticky, clingy, weird, icky vibration to be pushed into this magnetic field. What happens when you come out of it? Is everybody truly reset, or is it like the state you go in with, something happens with that? It either amplifies or decreases or whatever, but there's an outcome out the backside of that. I think that's what they would be waiting for in terms of their celestial alignment to return again. And Ransom, I would love to see that Mayan glyph or that Mayan drawing you have that they found that references 2024 end, because I want to see if there's any block walls represented in there or magnetic looping toroid fields represented in that. That most people might not look at that piece of iconography or that sculpture or whatever you would like to term it as, carving in rock, to mean that. But that's where I would look at specifically is what representation of magnetic field canceling is in there, along with any type of electromagnetism. Serpent might be a current flow, for example. There's a lot of things that could represent the energy moving and the density of the energy. If it's just electrons, could they glow? Yeah, you might have some like glowing serpent thing. What if it's plasma? Well, it can change color. It can go to pink, to blue, to white. It can just get all over the color spectrum in there. How do you represent that on a flat piece of stone? But there has to be that there so you could see it in a second and go, that's exactly what it is, once you know what you're looking for.
Yeah, I'm so fascinated with these charts and stuff that I imagine that if you got all the charts from different topics, sunspots, flares, all of the ice age data for the planet, and you kept lining these all up, that you would just see that all of them are on the same wave pattern. And if the elites, I'm just going out there, if they knew about this and they could plan for it, or they had some way of detecting when things would be, like maybe the last 26,000 years or before that, they already have seen these cycles go through. Somebody was keeping track of the solar system that long. So that means that they would know when these energetic events happen, when to plan everything from war to population growth or decrease.
And this also has cycles with it. Globally, there's cycles. And a lot of people are not talking about Wheeler's drought clock, but they should. Because as we have amplitude changes in the sun on the 11-year or 11.8-year solar cycle, solar maximum, solar minimum, and then within cycles of those, they come in 100-year bunches called the centennial minimums. 400-year cycles will bring us to grand solar minimums. And there's variances in solar activity. Well, the same would be true with drought clock. And Wheeler did an enormous amount of research on how this is a repeating pattern on either a 100-year, 170-year, or a 510-year approximate cogs in a wheel of global drought cycles. mapped. He did thousands and thousands of peer-reviewed research data points. He always liked to look at where the flow of debris would be. The heavier the flood, the larger the rocks that would move. The smaller the flood, the smaller the silt would fill in. And they did a lot of core samples and figured out where huge floods had come, or the periods that there was no inflow where the droughts were. Moving around the world and started to find similarities across all continents that it's on a cycle. And he mapped it out. And I encourage you to look at Dr. Wheeler's research on droughts across the planet, all 7 continents. Just like we see with solar activity. The de Vries cycle, 200-year cycle. What about the Schwab cycle or the Gleisberg cycle? And what's interesting is 2 of the Gleisberg cycles at 85 years each would match up with one of Dr. Wheeler's 170-year cycles. So if you double up some of these, you'll start to get into what Dr. Wheeler's research is that overlaps with the solar data. So the historical data, I want to dive a little deep in here because this is where you get a lot of points here. Through history, like in any culture, they're going to write down if something tumultuous happened that bent the society in terms of civil unrest, what caused it. And we go back through history. I mean, Chinese were meticulous. Talk about British being meticulous about taking records, and the Spanish with their fleets going to the New World. Oh no. Chinese put that to shame. They were so meticulous on what they had taken records for. So there's a lot of really good data left in such a recent time from 1644, which is the Qing dynasty, or Qing Dai. So what we're looking at, everywhere that you see a dot on the map was an instance of a drought taking place. And I want to match an apple with an apple because we're going into 1865, exactly the same drought that was referenced as a low point on the Yangtze River since records began. So I want to go to the exact same time frame again. And if you look at the center drought on the spider diagram here, you're going to see crop failures, famines, and locusts, which they don't have at this time, but maybe in the future. And then you just start mapping out the data here, which I'm glad they've already done for me, and that's why it's a peer-reviewed research paper, which is available for anybody to look up. And IPCC, I encourage you to do that because here's the title for you. The orange arrow I included because that's the reference point of the drought referenced at the lowest point in 1865. Now, in comparison to the rest of those droughts, 1865 is very small. The granddaddy was the very next drought, that was that mega drought in the last chart. Orders of magnitude above anything that occurred in the 1860s was 1870s. Now this really reset society. This is where the great famines came in. There was a full collapse in China of famine. I believe 20 million people starved to death during that time. Nothing with politics. This was just pure non-availability to grow food at that point. And then you can overlap some of the opium wars and the British intrusion into what is Hong Kong. And then that whole chapter of history starts there. But once you get these droughts, you overlap a few other crop failures, you get the famines, and this is the thing, you're going to get the social unrest that accompanies it. And I'd done these forecasts back in 2017 when I was doing the Adapt 2030 channel of following China in history, progressing, forecasting out where the crop losses would be first in China felt based on historical cycles. And you know where that red circle is around Henan and Shanxi? Right in that Yangtze River Delta Basin, because they always talked about that failing first through drought, then civil unrest followed. So here's a prediction from 2017 focused in the same area. Gee, it's not a crystal ball, it's a history book. So there's a term for this when China can't produce enough food and starvation comes in. The mandate from heaven is removed. And Emperor Xi is experiencing this at the moment, doing everything he can to stop the mandate. And when I say that, they looked at the stars in heaven as the Birkeland current coming down from the Big Dipper called the Beidou Qixing, and that's what they understood as the consciousness, or at least the flow of energies to power our star, to then allow consciousness as the human form to exist on this planet. Once that changes, and jet streams and cloud cells start to move, they understood that the current flow to the star changed. The electrical impulses changed. Electromagnetically, it changed. So when that changed, they thought that he was of God or some celestial being that could control that current flow. And if they couldn't, the mandate was removed. They no longer have authority to rule over the people. Well, the Brazilian agriculture official told China, okay, hold on, we're not going to give you any corn until next year. And you could read the article and go, whoa, they're going to embargo China. Brazil's not going to sell any corn. That's a head spinner. But then if you read deeper in the article, which I have here, pulled out this part, Beijing requested the monitoring of a few weeds and fungi in the corn crops. Rolling us back to the same problem. Herbicides, fungicides, pesticides. So they have a field of corn, but it's full of chest-high weeds. And they're in there with their combines, and it's all going into the same place. That's why China wants tests for these weeds. A, they don't want them in the food, and B, they don't want them exported or imported into China. Poisonous chemicals off of some of these plants, of course. You would definitely want your food tested. That's the reason they have herbicides. They spray that in there to knock out any other type of plant species that would want to grow there on the same soil. That way when you go through with the combine, you only get 100% corn. Normally, yeah, you might get a couple stragglers off the side or whatnot, a little morning glory in there. But the fungi, again, wet conditions, something's not growing correctly. Why would they target fungus? Fungus comes in wet conditions, which means volcanic aerosols blocking the sunlight so the UV doesn't disinfect it. That's why there's fungus. Chinese already understand this. They've been wiped out many a time from their dynasties. These 400-year cycles of solar activity, when the sun's magnetic fields decline, our jet streams and cloud cells go out of their phase once every 400 years. We're at that time again. Now, China's lived through this how many times going back? No Chinese dynasty has lasted longer than 400 years. And you wonder why? Well, they're back to this point, and they understand it too. She is trying to be the only leader of that country to ever survive and move through a grand solar minimum with power intact on the backside of it. So I can see easily why China would say, tell us about the fungus, tell us about the weeds. They know the cycles.
And that was also shown by, well, you go back to with the Mayans and coming up with Aquarius and this whole era of time from, say, 2012, which could have been a misinterpretation also. We don't know exactly. But you can't tell me within 2012 to 2020, 21, in this 10-year period, out of at least 2,000 to 3,000 years of forecasting in the future, they all hit it on the head. All belief systems, prophecy, everything talked about from supposedly disconnected continents, they all pinned to these couple years right here, and we're experiencing this right now.
History is history. We used to base the silver off the grains of the wheat. 252 grains of wheat would be the measure of silver. How hungry are you when you're giving away your family's dynastic wealth to be able to trade for food? Well, if it goes back to a gold and silver barter system where the gold standard and silver is used as currency, how hungry do you have to be to come back to actually trade your precious metals in to eat? We've seen it through history, and it's so clean on the coins. Look at that. Aksum, the top left is Aksum Kingdom. That ran down through the Red Sea, and they were involved in the frankincense route going through Saudi Arabia, and they controlled and issued the newest, cleanest gold coinage after the collapse of the Roman Empire. And on the right, obviously, what is that good for? Food, medicine, and entertainment. I mean, it's right there on the coin. And we're going to be looping back in history. We're going to go back to this again. You know, what are you going to trade for a mouthful of food is the question.
And what led me to this video and talking about cycles of time, Kyrgyzstan, new issuance of their postage stamp, Kyrgyz Express. Looks like a plasma glyph to me. And if you do look at Kyrgyzstan, the entire landscape seems to be of sculpting by wind, but supersonic wind, or electric forces. It's cool, littered with mountain ranges looking like arrows pointing into themselves. And closer to Suleiman, sacred mountain, Richtmeier, Meshnov, instability patterns. Must have been supersonic wind once again. Electric geology, electric universe. This one I think falls into the electrical category of plasma discharge onto the planet's surface. You can walk out after a strike point where the charge, where the current is flowing. And if you bring it on to the topography of Kyrgyzstan, I'm really going to laugh if you tell me that's erosion right there from water or wind. It's too perfectly placed. And you see the standing waves right about the 3 o'clock position come in off the crop grow zone, and you can see the direction of the wind that was pulling along with the current flow. Now back to these shock waves funneling like a nozzle of a hose, depositing material with the vibratory pattern. Very distinct once you start to know what it looks like. And if you look at different shock wave behaviors, you're getting a lot of stacking in the same exact expansion forms. The same standing wave forms at the base of the mountain range leading up to Tash Rabat. Also, when you reach the apex of the range there, you see the same standing waves. But here's where it gets a little bit interesting. This looks like the discharge point of the plasma itself hitting the Earth, as a discoloration and heating had reconstituted the elements and then melted them into this glacious form. But you can see the discharge and the wind pattern both at the same time. And in that darker green, the electrical filaments are quite visible there. Just spinning it, looking in a different direction of the same topography, but just at the base of that strike. And the mineral elements look as if they've been separated and then came back into those veins. And if you look through the center of this image, you'll see the same updraft deposition and layer creation. And other areas to the east or west of that range leading up to Tash Rabat, also incredibly interesting geology. Just don't see this. Filamentary electrical currents going into the crust in the winds layering and reforming what's now the river valleys. So think about it like this. The electrical discharge comes in from space or from another continental plate and discharges over this point in Kyrgyzstan, sending out electrical current, rearranging the crust along with the supersonic winds. But what would be at the very end of the terminus point of these electrical current filaments where they burn themselves out literally and the charge doesn't go any further? That's the terminus point. Something just like this, littering the landscape. Kyrgyzstan, there's millions of these. But then you have the shock wave with the wind, and this is just the very finest of material, like dust, if you will. Sand is blowing through the air, and where it terminates, you might see something similar to this. But that's at the very furthest reaches of the end of the shock wave where it would deposit loose gravel. So what you've seen here is occurrences and accounts of what had happened during the Younger Dryas, 12,000 years prior. This is a massive event. What if we come into a lighter version of something, electromagnetically changing our atmosphere, the crust itself creating more volcanoes and earthquakes? This grand solar minimum is here now. And at the same time in 2024, we have a planetary alignment of the gas giants, all four of them in a single quadrant of the solar system. And the best match is 79 AD, and the second best match is 1486. That's it in the last 2,000 years, and we're here again. You could expect that the cloud cells will be disrupted on the planet and go into different flows. So will the jet streams. But it's really about our ability to gauge food planting and harvesting dates. Because we've hit a year globally where agriculture has been tested, to say the least. And next year there will be fertilizer shortages, diminishing yields, in addition to what the Earth's weather is going to throw at us again. 2024, will those four gas giants have their own second magnetic field enough to intercouple with Earth in its regular combination of the sun's electromagnetic field? Perhaps this is why there's so many distractions happening now. This is the real reason for change. So a glimpse into Suleiman II, Sacred Mountain. I put the black arrow there. That is the direction of discharge during this event that created a sacred mountain. People ran there for safety. That as the shock envelope swept across the land, it turned everything into dust, comprised of the minerals within the dust. And that layer blew across the mountain, leaving what you see there on the hillside. That shock reflection is 90 degrees from the path of the blast. Wherever it's moving, go right or left, and that's where you'll start to see a lot of dendritic ridges. On the other side, you saw that huge dust layer covering the same exact mountain. Traditional geology tells us the entire mountain should be covered that deep, because if it was leaves that fell there after millions of years making soil and stuff blue, whatever, the excuse, time frames, millions, whatever, it should be the exact same around that mountain. But it's not. That wind came from the other direction, blowing all that material. There is a cave there, a massive cave. It's covered by a museum. But what I find so signal-giving here, the importance of those petroglyphs right there at the cave entrance. It's a museum now. What's the first thing you see? The petroglyphs. They're trying to show something magnificent happened here. Learn from it. Know the changes. Know the cycles. Look for the indicators. So here's the cave that many people took refuge in during this time. So think about that. All that wind, all that dust, rocks, everything piling up on the other side of the mountain, but you're watching it blow past you above your head. You think that would be a sacred site after the event finished and you lived through that? Now, this is the size of the cave entrance now, but it was a bit smaller before they did a bunch of renovations, turned this into a museum, put up the glass walling there. But as you enter, look how far down this thing goes. This was a refuge center. Maybe it was just a lucky one, that it was just in the right place at the right time and everybody could get there. And in this map from 1889, the blast pattern would have been following the line on the bottom straight, and that wind would have been, well, you can see exactly where it's going. The artist did a very good job of showing you how it's stacking up with the winds, just like sand dunes. Which direction is the wind going? All toward that center, which was the covered now with very fine dust of the same size in the sacred mountain of where the cave is. And off to the right, you can see there were some airburst features. Would be to the east. What's it look like? The feathers. So the inhabitants of our earth 12,000 years ago ran to these caverns. And that's the reason you're here today. And you might want to check out the Younger Dryas and how quickly the temperature dropped and how quickly it rose back up, and why there were so few people left. So if people did witness this, and the petroglyphs are of electrical discharge in our atmosphere, plasma, lightning holding state for 2 minutes in the atmosphere, dancing across the skies, that's what you're seeing on the canyon walls. But would there be physical evidence with what was left in terms of the petroglyphs and now what we can replicate in the plasma laboratory? Andy Hall, thank you for putting all the prior research together. I'm just showing you a spot on the planet where it is. Thunderbolts project, everything's electric, bow shock, melting and plowing the ground. So what does that mean for you and me? Well, it can happen in one of two ways. It can be a plasma bolt, literally interplanetary lightning, or continental plate to continental plate lightning, something that gigantic. Rip up the ground 500 miles from where it struck or more and turn it into dust. This type of so far off the scale of even comprehension in terms of multiplying what you know now, the biggest you can possibly multiply it in your mind, and then multiply that by 100 again. That kind of lightning. Or what we saw in Chelyabinsk coming over, whoosh, that bolide hit and it created the concussion, just like Tunguska. Either mechanism, same result. Although some are more identifiable than others, you're going to start to get patterns. As these dielectric properties mix and match, hydrodynamics, aerodynamics, supersonic winds, ionized base minerals out of the crust of the earth, leaving visible traces. Follow the wind. Follow the pattern. Follow the vibration. Follow the interference wave or electrical discharge. Brownian tree, electrical scarring, Kyrgyzstan. Visible right in front of you. That coloration is something else. How far in each direction do you think that vein that was cracked has refilled with some other mineral? Like quartz, for example. Hyperconductive. Airburst feature, what would happen with the cyclonic winds in full updraft above our atmosphere? A divoting of the Earth's surface with the electrical scarring running down the center, showing you which direction the winds went. It would be more of what we've seen in some of the 1950s low-grade nuclear tests in the desert. Single shock wave followed by multiple shock waves, and with the dielectric properties separating material by charge and element, you should start to see patterning of heavier to lighter materials along these same exact lines of strong secondary waves. And what do we have here? Top right, the butterfly pattern. That's the bolide above Earth shock wave impetus drawing up above Earth's atmosphere. Supersonic winds. But far from the blast pattern, far from there, you would also have that same amount of ionized particles coming from that discharge, layering themselves, blowing like grains of sand across the desert. Now scale it to this here in Kyrgyzstan. This is electric geology. You know how big some of the sand dunes you've seen at beaches, possibly if you've been in the desert. In the Sahara, that'll rival the largest sand dunes out there. So where did all this superfine particulate come from to make that sand pattern in the wind? Well, it's actually an ionized wind blowing apart the surface of the Earth to the point where everything's rearranging itself by density in the atomic scale and layering. That's what you're seeing. But then the dielectric properties of the minerals in our crust would start layering themselves, along with shockwave wind formation patterns up hillsides. Stratification. You're seeing it right in front of you. I bet there's a lot of really good mineral deposits in that country. And here we have those that witnessed the event some 10, 12,000 years ago, or earlier, some say 4,000. What we can replicate now in the plasma laboratory is what was seen and what was left in these canyon walls. I'll run through a few images here for you. I've linked everything in the description box below so you can chase down your own information. Thunderbolts, electric geology, electric universe, sapphire, S-A-F-I-R-E. And do you see the centipede in the center? And at the bottom left, the star. X flares have an X. I wonder how many. It would be X100, and it would have something shining as a six-sided star. Squatter Man is just the base for all the electric formations to grow off of, following the same circuit down the center. Squatter Man, the most famous across the planet, seen in every culture, mentioned in every culture, references and iconography, images, paintings, drawings, carvings in every culture across the planet. It must be the first one to be seen. So when you surpass a certain type of charge, this will glow first. In the heavens, something like this, would you keep going to work if you saw that? Would you save for your retirement if you saw that? Now what if you knew this would be back in 2024, October? And I'll bring you some different plasma experiments here on the right. I see number 7 on the left looking very similar. And you can see 12 starting to take on some similar configuration, 11 as well. What you're looking at is charge state. What I would do is rearrange the petroglyphs by the charge that they first start glowing and taking shape that people could carve them on the canyon wall. I'll say number 22 and number 20 are the strongest current flow versus number 5, which is the beginning. See, glyph number 5 is on the bottom right in the plasma laboratory. But then glyph number 17 is the top left. You can see the charge states increased. So is the vibration, so is the change in the plasma itself. The frequency is changing, so the plasma is going to change in intensity and what it does, how it glows, what it looks like, what shape it takes. So again, I'll say right up there, number 22 will probably be one of the highest charges on the entire spectrum there. Starting with number 5 should be the top left, and 22 should be the bottom right, and then you can fill in the rest. And the plasma columns that you're seeing are actually connecting out through the ionosphere, way above the mesosphere, back to the sun. So when they're illuminating, below what you're going to see are electric elves encircling the Earth's magnetic field line. So whatever they witnessed at that mountain must have been much lower in the atmosphere. So I'm wondering how that phenomena could occur 300 miles further down into our atmosphere. I mean, these discharges I'm showing you here are far orders of magnitude compared to a grand solar minimum, but the same rules apply. The vibration's changing. So instead of it being a mountain range moved by ionic action, think about how the cloud layers, the cloud cells, the jet streams could be moved by electrical current moving out of our crust into the upper atmosphere, trying to equalize with the sun. A cloud's much more pliable than a rock. So it really would only take a small current change to change the cloud layers and move the atmosphere more. Then it would be noticeable with this kind of discharge that the ancients witnessed and then gave us warnings across all the canyon walls.
And this may be the event that they've actually been planning on. We always talk about what is they planning for? What is it? And I wanted to point out about the sheep dying. And you remember when we were talking about that when it was unknown what killed the cattle, and you were talking about you really thought it was something from the atmosphere, above the atmosphere, and then
it was those halo sprites that look like a double-headed eagle in the sky. Is that the same one? That's crazy.
That's right. What's the deal with these sheep?
Same thing. It was a tear in the electromagnetic field that allowed that radiation to bombard them, but they were higher up in the elevation. And what's interesting is the Egyptians have the same stories, is where, the mountaintops fried and anybody there was cooked into a microwave oven. Well, that's UVB or UVC radiation. But then at the same time, those on the shorelines were inundated by 1,200-foot tall waves. We're talking cataclysmic events, but a tear in the magnetic field at this point would send UVB down to probably ground level. And this is, especially of the sheep, where they're at 3,000, 5,000 feet. You'd have to also look at the grasses and things to see if it was scarred or some sort of beyond what the animal deaths were. Is anybody taking a look at the plant life around there? Insect life? Amphibian life, to see if it was also affected by the increasing radiation that seems to be taking these animals out, or electrified fields intensifying. And, to see a double-headed eagle in the sky above that event, it's a little too quirky that, some of these elitist families that we've been referencing through here that still have control after thousands of years are the double-headed eagle. So did they see a plasma display in the sky and took that reference as their coat of arms? Because that double-headed eagle, that's really difficult to dismiss that one. And imagine if it goes orders of magnitude above, it would take the same shape, but it'd be more precise on where the beaks are. And however far out that plasma filament goes and starts, at the tendril at the end, and then out of those beaks came some sort of flashing thing, which would look like a serpent tongue or something like this. And let that dance around in the sky for a while, and then put it so big that an entire continent sees it or the entire planet sees it, and then try to describe it. Aside from that, nature's doing its own thing because the electromagnetic field of the planet's changing. But that's changing the jet streams and cloud cells and creating different flows in what you consider weather or quote-unquote climate. And then that in turn affects the food production. But all these three things are happening simultaneously: the destruction of what you consider civilization. So, you go back through the petroglyphs and different amazing rock artwork on canyon walls. And if that was to go out and amplify, that would glow in the sky, and you would definitely see that on the wall of a canyon somewhere, referencing what we're looking at here. So, all this is in real time, playing out, and then suddenly the Great Reset's here, and you can see how everything is dovetailing and overlapping at once. But see, that's subset A of information, then what's next, And as soon as I saw this still image right here, I thought to myself, I have seen this several times in plasma experiments in laboratories. So I decided to spend some time in that 7 full-minute video. Of course, the debunkers would say, well, it's just cracks in the glass in an airplane and swamp gas and bouncing light. But when you look at it, you can actually see it shift the shape. Somebody captured this at 30,000 feet, so the visual on the ground level would be very different, but 7 minutes traveling at 500 miles per hour would also give you a different visual reference. Now, perhaps I could have believed the cracked glass frozen something on the window if it had remained at this exact shape, but it didn't. It changed. So a basic primer to plasma petroglyphs, what is now replicated and photographed in laboratory experiments, has also seen on our canyon walls, cave paintings throughout antiquity. The ancients witnessed these events in our skies, but at incredible large levels,
as something happens with our sun, our magnetosphere here on the planet. And they recorded it for us as a warning. Now, if we're talking about inflows of current in plasma columns, we start to see shapes that look like a person's head reaching with the arms up to the heavens. So I will ask you, the petroglyphs below that were done in this original analysis match very well with what was just seen off this airplane. But you notice where the body is down to where the feet would be, there's several layers of separation. It looks like filaments or field-aligned filaments in there, different charges between the two, possibly. But also looking at visible manifestations of plasma arc discharge phenomenon, you come back into these same shapes again and again. And what they find is this outflow of the torus is in relatively dense magnetospheric plasma. So from 30,000 feet and many miles away looking out the plane window, how large of an area was this that started to turn on and go into glow mode? There's been an enormous amount of, shall we say, strangeness when you have these white northern lights, first time ever captured just 2 years ago. The atmospheric sprites are increasing in intensity, which means electrification, increase in Earth's atmosphere. And speaking of Steve, this was a plasma rope, plasma filament, named in 2017 on the far right image because it was the first time it had ever been seen or recorded. Now, since that time, it's been seen dozens and now 100 plus times. Each time, you can see the looping field-aligned currents. Each of those current loops is a different charge creating that rope. Birkeling current is another way to term that. Moving over to Squatter Man, seen across the planet, every culture, look it up yourself, Squatter Man, and you'll find the same exact representation of a standing human, 2 arms, 2 legs, sometimes dots next to them. Voltage, you're looking at the exact same thing with just different current inflow into it. Question, which one's spinning faster? Which one's more highly charged? And it doesn't take too much of a stretch of the imagination to look and say, wow, Squatter Man, if it were to appear in our skies that large, the aurora rope is already getting to such a gigantic width that that is the center body taking form in our skies as we speak. So these changes are real, and there shall be signs in the heavens and signs in the skies. Because when Squatter Man comes to life in the skies above you, that's 15, 20 miles high, taking up the entire horizon, people just aren't going to go to work anymore. Because anything you can replicate in a lab that's on a canyon wall, there seems to be a very strong correlation between the two of people witnessed it. It was such an all-encompassing event for society. It was left in the walls as a warning to us. But somebody did survive, and they left all of these petroglyphs for us to try to understand, decipher in a plasma laboratory right now, 2021. Could we replicate something by putting more voltage or current through a plasma field and coming out with some of the same shapes? Because as you look across the world, you see the same exact iconography on all the canyon walls. All cultures all have the same similar shapes. 12,000 years ago. Back to the video, you can see the state changing as the input of voltage increases. You can see the state of that object changing in the sky. So now my next question is, which petroglyphs most closely match this? And all of these are from the desert southwest in the United States. So is it the objects reaching to the heavens? And you notice the one white right in the center there matches up pretty well with what we're seeing. And when you get to striations, they could be different current fields showing the break-in pattern instead of being a solid white object. But on the left, whatever was seen was something very similar. Now, it looks like it had a different color within there. So you can go for days looking at these canyon wall pictures and continue to find things that match up very closely. Because even today, it's difficult to describe what this is here. You could call it Jacob's Ladder, an auroral picket fence, whatever your name is for it. But imagine if it's the first time you've ever seen it and it appears in your sky like over Cuba, and you're not used to seeing this, and then all of your electricity goes out, and that's the end of your society. how would you describe that and be like, whoa, if you ever see this again, be real careful. Then I started to find aurora replicated and referenced as Egyptian iconography, and this takes you down the rabbit hole as deep as you want to go. These signals in the sky also signal that our growth seasons are changing, and where we can grow food presently is not going to hold where it can grow either. A lot of changes in the agriculture industry as you see across the planet, rising food prices. It's all related to this. Ancient history reflects where we're going in the future. And as always, looking at lost history, we're talking about the British explorer Alfred Isaac Middleton. This is a well-known explorer. He went to the most remote places that were literally off the map. When you looked at those old maps and there was just something in the middle that said unknown, that's where he went. Areas in Amazon, areas in Africa, areas in Southeast Asia, way in the late 1800s. Fabled explorer. So these are some of the images and graphics that were coming out of his collection. So as I look at this, that is very realistic in the way that if it was softer stone, it could have been carved. There's temples on the left, very Greek looking, carved into the mountains, level upon level. And it just depends really how hard that stone is and if you could work it with simple tools. Because if you go to Cappadocia, which is in Turkey, Gorame, and then Derinyenku is very close to there, the underground city, you'll start to see some of the very same ideas of carving out mountains up the face to create structures out of it. And this is in Saudi Arabia as well. Notice the mud flood level there at the doorway height. They unburied that. A lot of soft stone structures can be carved out of. So there is validity to what we're seeing in that lithographs. And accompanied with the photo collection here, I don't have a location on this, but it is so interesting that I needed to share. It does show you people standing or statues, whatever those would appear to be. And if it was workable stone or if there was some sort of overhanging cliff structures, this is exactly what we're seeing. But then we get into a little bit different woodworking canopy here. And if you do have information on where the location was, I know it was prior to 1901 when he disappeared. So this would have been late 1890s, somewhere around that time. And the one that I had to shake my head and think, how did they carve this? But if you're looking with something soft, limestone, and it does appear that they're going back into a cave directly back on the bottom left there, that is a cave entrance. Above the cave, below the cave, in the cave gives credence to those running from plasma discharge in our atmosphere and heavens would definitely be able to live through an event if they were to be this close, living above and below and having the observatory at the apex of that structure. The world's hidden. How many times has it been reset?
What were all these ancient people saying? What were all these people trying to remember? We must take the words left to us in generations of oral histories and written records of observations in the sky as instances of events that were not the norm. They were so important and unusual that they have come through time as warnings left by our brothers and sisters of the ancient past. These events were not lunar eclipses or earthquakes. Now in this time, with our understanding of celestial mechanics, atmospheric and geological sciences, we must try to make sense of these recorded events and untangle them from worship and prophecy. It's time to look at them for what they actually provide as a roadmap of things to come. Has the world experienced a global cataclysm before? And will it happen again? And what was remembered and how is it described to begin again? The voices call out from the ancient American Indians, and this is the ninth and last sign. You will hear a dwelling place in the heavens above the earth that shall fall in a great crash. It will appear as a blue star. Very soon after this, the ceremonies of my people will cease. Has this cataclysm happened before? The voices call out from ancient China. There were seen fire-breathing dragons leaping into the sky. They call out from ancient Siberia. The earth was on fire from both horizons. And they call again from the ancient past in the voices of the Inca. At the Intihuatana was a stone cut with great precision to observe and measure the movements of the sun. The name meant that which binds the sun, and it makes it return, lest it disappear, returning the earth into a darkness that had occurred once before, according to the legends. Did the Inca, Chinese, Siberians, and the rest remember the last micronova event in their oral histories? We need to take these people seriously.
What's called the 4 o'clock rapids, 56 concentric. Actually, it's less than that because these have started to undergo rotation. Here's one on the Navajo Reservation, Bronze Shield, 3rd millennium, Middle East. This is a 56 ray from Kazakhstan. Somebody locked the doors because at this point people are going to start escaping, but this is a 56 ray circle axis mundi from China. And these are actually drawn as paintbrushes. You know, the axis mundi here, the tree coming up in the center. But anyway, the 56 are there. In Arizona, it says the same thing. Pick that one up. This is unfair. I picked the penumbra of a dense plasma focus, which also has 56, but it's a plasma, so we would expect it.
A consistency of reports from around the world of catastrophes that are amazingly similar. But a lot of people thought it's just what people dream up when they have a lot of time or they're dreaming or whatever. It's just stuff that people naturally come up with. Velikovsky thought it was catastrophes that people witnessed and remembered as very different.
It's one thing to look back at our ancestors and the stories they tell and say, you know what? You guys did a pretty good job inventing geometry, philosophy, architecture, but we're going to just take your most important stories and just going to pretend that you guys are crazy and made them up. That's one giant leap, especially when they could predict eclipses.
The U.S. government knows some of this stuff. They know the sun does nova. There's no debate about that. The question is they don't want you guys to know about it. If it's no longer a secret, there's no point in keeping it a secret. They're desperately looking for any other explanation. Don't look at the sun. That's it.
It's not what they taught you in school because they gave you it nice and coded. But again, remember, the people in the U.S. government who saw the sun flare up and get the information back from the moon when we brought the stuff back, they were mostly scared. The sun does something terrible. They didn't know when. They felt they had no power to change it. See, our tools have shown us things that they couldn't have possibly seen 50 and 70 years ago.
Question number 1. What is the best evidence of the solar micronova? Well, first of all, in that playlist down below the video, we give all of the evidence. My favorite would be the nova level isotopes. Yes, we know there's a magnetic excursion at every single one of these cycles. We know there's volcanoes at every one of these cycles. We know there's major climate shifts and disappearances of species. But there are also nova level isotopes, isotopes that you can't get without a nova level event on a star. Not even an impactor creates enough heat to, what they say in theory, would be able to actually create some of these isotopes. So it is those isotopes that really tell us that this is what's happening on the sun, because it would take too long for those isotopes to get here. And if they were from another star, not to mention that most of them have short enough half-lives that they would have decayed before they got here. Beyond that, if there was a second place, we know that there are solar cycles of 11 years, 5.9 months, 200 years, 88 years. But we also know that there's the millennial, 3,000 and 6,000 year super flare cycles, and those were just recently discovered. All you have to do is scale that up one more time, and you get to the 12,000 year mark, and every time you scale it up, you get a little bit bigger of a solar blast. And so at the 6,000 year mark, we know it's about an X1000 super flare. So at the 12,000 year mark, we are well within micronova range.
How did things like mammoths freeze so quickly in the last event? Well, the interesting thing about that is they have done studies and they have figured out that there is basically no way they could think of to actually get the mammoths to freeze so quickly, to actually stop chemical digestion in their stomachs. These were not small creatures. I mean, even if you drop the temperature to a psychotically low amount just outside of the mammoth, inside of the mammoth, it's still kind of warm for a little while. And of course, we found undigested mammoths, food that the mammoths were eating in their mouths and in their stomachs, inundating them with frozen water, with ice, not going to do it. Dumping a ton of snow on them, not going to do it. Even, having part of the atmosphere get blasted away in the cold of space coming down, it's not going to do it. What could do it, however, is a saturation of plasma in the ways that is known to cool. Now, there have been several papers on plasma cooling and how that can work. But, we tend to mostly think of plasma as something that's going to be heating. It's just, it causes things to heat up, but that's not always the case. It really depends on what kind of plasma you're talking about. Remember, electrons are plasma, protons are plasma. The rate of plasma expansion in the area, the rate of flow. There's so many things that determine exactly what effects that plasma is going to be having on the material that is taking that bombardment. And so that's really, in my opinion, since there is no other way scientifically to actually freeze a mammoth so quickly as to stop digestion in its stomach before some of that stuff could be digested. And we know that in this major event that happens to the Earth, specifically the solar micronova, magnetic excursion, arc discharging, and basically the electromagnetic reset of the planet, the number one thing involved in that is going to be plasma and magnetic fields. But the plasma aspect, specifically plasma cooling, is the best explanation for how you freeze a mammoth so quickly. I am still getting questions every day. What is happening with the magnetic field? How bad will it get? When will the biggest effects take place? When will things start to get so bad that society has a difficult time moving on? What is the sun going to do? What is the earth going to do? What should we expect in terms of weather, in terms of radiation, earthquakes, volcanoes? All of that stuff is in the Earth Disaster playlist right below the video in the description box. It's time people start doing their homework. This is not a house for rookies. I do take the time to try to answer questions like this, and every year for the past couple of years I have gone and remade these disaster videos with the most up-to-date information. This playlist down below the video is all the most recent stuff. There is one question I will answer a bit more fully and not just tell you go watch the playlist. How will we survive? And I will tell you this, and I've mentioned it before. We are survivors. It's in our DNA. We are all the children of the children of the children of survivors of the last one and the one before and the one before that. The cultures that appeared to do the best after the last disaster had two things in common: altitude and underground shelter. Now, this does not mean go take a shovel to the top of Mount Everest, but a considerable distance away from the coastlines where the major continental level tsunamis are going to be coming from. And you want to be up high in relative elevation, but you also need something underground. This is not only due to the radiation that's going to be spiking as Earth's magnetic field weakens, but the weather should be pretty extreme as well. That is in terms of the wind, the lightning, the temperature extremes. You do want to have that kind of shelter as well. And not to mention that it will protect more against major temperature shifts. The wind isn't going to blow over something that is built into the ground. It's not about asking the question of how deep underground should you go. It's about asking the question of what's my local magnetic conditions. Am I in an area that is more likely to take a stronger induction? And just FYI, the two places that'll take the strongest induction are under the magnetic equator and under the aurora, basically putting somewhere around mid-latitude. I know some of you are going to take this one and run with it, but it does look like somewhere around the 30 to 33 degree latitude north and south of the equator would have the least amount of magnetic induction.
How long will we need to be underground? Not as long as many of you think. The underground aspect of this is really needed for if the micronova happens while it's up above your head. When any of the pieces of the micronova are coming down. You certainly don't want to be too far underground if you are in one of the zones where the continental waves are coming. You're either going to be washed over and flooded out or trapped beneath the muck and the mud and not able to get out afterwards. It's basically for extreme situations. Another one of those would be the climate will be pretty extreme after this. The storms, the lightning, the hail, the wind will be pretty extreme, and so it will be advantageous to have somewhere that one can retreat. But no, it's not like you're going to be sitting there in caves trying to survive for years and years and years. No. On that point, the entire world is going to shake in the great earthquake when this happens. The last place I would want to be is a deep underground military base, the things you guys call dumps. I don't know who told them to build these. I don't know who told them it's a good idea to be down there in one of them. I don't think a single deep underground thing is going to make it. The earth is going to shake so violently. All of those are going to be basically shaken apart, collapsed into. I really do not see any way it is a smart idea to be there. You do need something just underground for the protection that we have discussed, but I mean, that could be a root cellar. In certain parts of the world, a basement is going to work. Probably not the best option, by the way, but a concrete or hempcrete bunker that's even half underground and then half covered on top, that's going to be better than being in a deep underground base, and I have very little doubt about that.
What is a bug-out worthy event? You see people on the internet, anytime there's even like a little M-class solar flare that's fired at the Earth, people are freaking out. This is going to be it. This is going to be it. And most of the time, observers are pretty good at not falling into that. But it does beg the question, what is a bug-out worthy event? And I'm really going to focus on the natural aspects of this. Obviously, if countries start launching nukes at each other, things are pretty much going in the toilet right away. But here are some things you can look for. Global GPS failures, or near global GPS failures. If all of a sudden your phone thinks you're 10 states away or in another country, or it tells you you're in the middle of the ocean, and this is happening everywhere. We're talking like this is major news, and they're not telling you why. You can know that it is because Earth's magnetic field has begun an accelerated rapid shift, and the data just can't keep up. Something like that happening worldwide is definitely an indication that stuff's about to get bad very, very quickly. Another good one, if they all of a sudden, inexplicably, or for a ridiculous reason that you can tell is a ridiculous reason, ground all air travel, or planes start falling out of the sky all over the world for no reason. Things like that as well will really indicate that there is a major, major problem with Earth's magnetic field. If there is an X20 solar flare or higher directly aimed at Earth, I'm not talking about it's over at the limb, I'm talking about it's dead center, it's fired right at us. Same would be if we get 3 or 4 X10s fired right at us. There's still a chance in that case that you might have to put your tail between your legs and come back home a couple days later. But at that level of a solar event, with the magnetic field as it is right now, you have to at least start thinking in that way. And the other thing that I would say is a major bug out event is if a super volcano goes off. If Campi Flegrei in Italy or Taupo in New Zealand goes off, that's definitely going to be the start of the destabilization. Pretty clear signal there, pretty easy to see. People still asking about Yellowstone all the time. First of all, those people have not watched the playlist and seen the 5 or 6 times we've talked about Yellowstone, but I'll mention it again here. No, Yellowstone is broken. There is no other volcano in the world, super volcano or otherwise, that can boast its pressure release. It has geysers, it has seismic activity, it has geothermal release. It has no way to actually build up pressure. The moment pressure gets built up beneath there, it just blows it out. Now, it is an effusive eruption risk, effusive being like what Hawaii does, where it just kind of bubbles up and comes out. But it's not the explosive risk like what took out Woody Harrelson in the movie 2012. Again, all of that is in the playlist below the video.
Can we expect structure fires from a major solar event? Absolutely. In 1859, telegraph wires caught on fire. There were even fires in some of the telegraph offices. They unplugged the machines and messages kept transmitting. And the 1859 event, the Carrington event, that was nowhere near what the sun can do. And Earth's magnetic field was relatively strong at that point. So the overall question to structure fires in the Great Solar Event is a big yes.
So it would really be those extreme levels of solar activity, volcanic activity, or magnetic field activity that really tell you, okay, we have crossed that threshold and we're not going back to normal.
Question we get a lot is, when is the sun going to turn red? When is it going to darken? When is it going to turn black? Well, unfortunately, that's probably only going to be about 1 to 3 days before the actual micronova happens. And the reason for this, in addition to those of you who take a more religious or mythology aspect to it, that's about what they talk about in those old stories. But also, when we have the actual galactic magnetic reversal at the sun, yes, it is in progress right now. The entire solar system is shifting. But when we actually hit that flip point in the middle, where magnetism is zero, we are going to see two things. One, there's going to be a dimming of the sun. We've seen several articles about stellar dimming, and we actually just saw one this morning if you caught the morning news. And in addition to its intrinsic luminosity decreasing, when we actually hit that galactic 0 point and we have the galactic magnetic reversal, we're going to see the sun lose its ability to really blast away the dust and the other material in the inner solar system. And it's going to begin to accumulate in the upper atmosphere of the sun, the corona. And so both the intrinsic luminosity decrease and the blocking by the accumulated material is going to be what's causing the actual decrease in the sun's light, the changing of the colors, things like that. But it's not going to last very long at all. A couple days later, maybe 1 to 3 days later, that galactic magnetic energy is going to reinvigorate the sun, and it's going to have that blast away power again, and it is going to shake off that shell like a snake shedding its skin, and that's what's going to be the solar micronova. Stories of the sun turning black are in fact a part of this. My favorite ones come from Egypt, but those are not the only ones. It should be a progression from red to darkish red to black, and then solar micronova like that. Get a lot of questions about what are the components of the micronova, and there are several. We go over all of this in the playlist down below the video. Happy to do it again now. After there is the darkening. When the actual micronova occurs, there's going to be a major flash. This is going to be in the light-based energy, and it will arrive here in 8 minutes. This will be optical light, this will be ultraviolet, extreme ultraviolet, X-ray, probably some gamma rays as well. Over the next several hours, as the actual shell of the micronova is heading towards Earth, we are going to see an increase in cosmic rays and solar energetic particles. These will basically be the most highest energy protons and electrons, and those are going to be mostly funneled to where the poles are at that time, the magnetic poles at that time. As we actually get the shell impact, that's when we're going to have all of the larger items. That would be the heavier isotopes, the helium, the dust that is carrying the isotopes, and any of the plasma that is actually congealed into impactors. That's when those will hit as well, probably 14 to 18 hours after the actual micronova, which is also the reason why we have impactors at every single iteration of the cycle. Now, every time I mention this, someone's like, Ben, you should talk to Randall Carlson. First of all, I don't think I've ever called him and he not picked up the phone. There is video of Randall and I in these playlists you can watch, and the key part of my interview with Randall is in the disaster movie, which is the first thing in the playlist. This is why so many people blame the Younger Dryas on an impactor only, forgetting the fact that it can't produce nova-level isotopes or a geomagnetic excursion or produce volcanoes on the other side of the world or any of the other things that we actually know come with these cycles. But yes, there are impactors as well, and those come when the actual nova shell hits. There's a question about when does the cold happen, this new ice age that's coming? And the answer is with the micronova. The micronova itself is actually the cooling event. And here's why. After the micronova, we are going to have dust and a ton of other accumulated material, not only in the upper atmosphere of the Earth, blocking out sunlight like a volcanic or nuclear winter, but it's going to be between the sun and the Earth as well. barely going to get any sunlight for a little while, and that is what's going to pretty rapidly freeze the planet. Now, here's the good news. We can currently get the question, how long is that cold going to last? And the answer is, from all the geologic evidence and even some of the stories of mythology, not very long at all. In the wake of the micronova explosion, the reorganization of the magnetic fields and the stellar surface on the sun, it's going to be pretty tumultuous up there. It's going to be firing super flares almost every day. And that has a major heating effect. For any of you who saw our interview with Robert Schoch 8 years ago, again, the best part of that is also in the disaster movie, the first one in the playlist. The Ice Age may have really ended in just a matter of days, and there's no reason to believe that that's not what's going to happen again. The super flaring will be so extreme that it's going to very quickly blast away that material, and then when it starts blasting that material away and that energy is able to more effectively get into the earth, that covering in the atmosphere will act more like an insulator to trap in heat than anything else. And so, as I have said before, yes, this event is like the last minute of the Super Bowl, and it's a tie game. Your heart hits your feet 100 times in that last minute. But when it's over, things do return relatively quickly, and they return to a relatively stable state both on the Earth and on the Sun. Whether that is a matter of days or a matter of weeks, even up to a matter of months, can't really say. That one's hard to know. We don't have a crystal ball like that, but we do know it's not so long that the entire world dies. It's not so long that humans haven't managed to survive every single one of them. So, yes, this is a very serious thing, but never forget, we are all the children of survivors. It is in our DNA. You are a survivor. I am a survivor. Everyone on this planet has it in them somewhere. Yeah, we're not all going to make it, as Billy once said, but there is the ability to do it. The world is going to come back relatively rapidly. Yes, you will need food stored, water stored, other supplies so you can make it through that recovery period, especially if that is in the weeks to months range. But this is not a reason to have despair. It's not a reason to have fear, which is nothing but a thief of time and focus and energy. Awareness of something scary doesn't have to result in fear. It should result in your awareness of it, the continued investigation and keeping up to date with it so you stay informed, and the preparation for it, because as I've mentioned before, every single time this has happened, and you can find several of these cycles in some of the Indian texts, but specifically with 12,000 years ago, all of the major cultures that appeared to have survival success all had certain things in common. They all did certain things, and the things they were doing all implied they knew it was coming. So that's where it starts.
This event would be extreme. You can survive it, but the shock and awe to the circuitry inside is real. If you've ever seen someone in legitimate shock, you know that. That cannot be you if your children are depending on you. This fortress must be ready. A key aspect of mental practice is informational. Situational awareness is key, and as example, I'll use New Mexico, where I live. Good to know where the waterways are, especially in a desert. Even a small stream nearby can be a bounty. If you know about local elevation, that helps too, especially in relation to ocean proximity, snow caps, or other temperature change between peak and canyon at the same latitude. Other sites to know, and everyone knows Carlsbad Caverns around here, so maybe some others might make your list. Certainly the mining operation maps of your local area could be good in case you need to flee cosmic plasma or into the warmer rock of the crust. And for the same reason, the cavern systems of your area are good things to know as well. It is critical that you apply these basic principles to your own situation, for your own awareness, to mitigate the system shock of the event. There is no real way to prepare for what terrified our ancestors, what glazed the moon, and which may happen again. But you simply don't have time to think about these things at that moment. It is as important to understand them now as it is to stock food, water, and seeds. There is evidence of tremendous retreat of the populace into caves and tunnels thousands of years ago. Multiple times, actually. These tunnels have been reused countless times over history, including during wartime and by smugglers, but their purpose was once to house the humans who, for some reason, could not remain at the surface. As terrible as this event is, we must remember that we are here today, so we have survived countless catastrophes and come out on top of this world. We are survivors. Our government appears to believe it has what it takes for the country to survive. What may have begun as underground shelter for the military elites, and which may have expanded as the result of threat of nuclear war in the mid-20th century. What exists now is a complex, interconnected underground world, far greater in capacity than could ever be needed by the military. One must genuinely begin to ask how many people could fit down there. There are many maps on the internet and lists of deep bunkers and bases, but these are just the ones we know about. Most on these maps are even acknowledged publicly. There's no telling just how much more exists and how ready the country really is. Provided we aren't all whisked underground into an unimaginable catacomb beneath us in the greatest feat of engineering in history, there is no reason you cannot do what your ancestors did. You may not live that way now, and you may be dependent on electricity, but the fact that we know how they lived back then means we have the tools at our fingertips in the age of information. How convenient it would rise before the fall. Here is a bit more on the intellectual side of prepping, but from a non-tangible perspective, a scene from one of the episodes preceding this infomentary.
Eyes open. No fear. Be safe, everyone.